Srdačan pozdrav, dragi gledatelji. Večeras uranjamo u svijet jednog od najzagonetnijih i najgenijalnijih pisaca 20. stoljeća, Fernanda Pessoe. Portugalac s 1000 lica i nijednim stvarnim identitetom. Pjesnik nemira, melankolije, introspekcije. Nije pisao samo kao jedan pisac. On je stvarao svjetove unutar sebe, govorio glasovima svojih mnogih heteronima i kroz njih razotkrivao dubine ljudske psihe. Koliko ga je uopće moguće spoznati, zna naš najcjenjeniji luzitanist i prevoditelj Nikica Talan.
Tko je za me Fernando Pessoa? Dakle, pitanje na koje je vrlo teško odgovoriti, za razliku od pitanja tko nije, odnosno točnije što nije Fernando Pessoa. A Fernando Pessoa za mene sigurno nije ozbiljnost, sigurno nije rutina, sigurno nije učmalost i sve one druge stvari koje otežavaju i zagorčavaju naše živote, kako bi rekao sam Fernando. Moje prvo druženje s Pessoom, točnije s njegovim opusom, započelo je negdje sredinom 80. godina prošlog stoljeća, kada sam slušao seminare s područja barokne glazbe, usavršavanje u interpretaciji konkretno Bachovih korala. Tada sam prvi put čuo ne za Pessou, ali za njegov heteronim Albertu Caeiru. Ali jednako tako čuo sam i za vrlo neobičnu definiciju Fernanda Pessoe kao načovjeka, i ne bilo kakvog načovjeka, nego neukrotiva načovjeka ili neukrotiva čudovišta. I ta definicija me navela na to da se zamislim da počnem proučavati Pessou, tim više što je moj profesor, znači poznati portugalski orguljaš, Francuz po nacionalnosti, koji je bio strastveni obožavatelj, kako je sam govorio, Pessoe, me zamolio da za domaću zadaću pročitam 10-ak pjesama Pessoina heteronima Alberta Caeira. Tu neobičnu zadaću sam doduše izvršio, premda nevoljko. Mislio sam da je profesor prolupao, no poslije se pokazalo da tome nije tako i da doista postoji nešto što se može nazvati baroknom jednostavnošću. I taj Alberto Caeiro otkrio mi je nepoznati svijet, svijet čiji ja dotad nisam bio dio. Naime, barok je za me bio do tog vremena sinonim za lepršavost, trilere, za mordente, za ukrase ovog i onog tipa, i to nagomilane ukrase, a profesor mi je preko Pessoe nastojao upozoriti na to da je moguć jednostavni barok i da upravo u takvom baroku možemo najviše uživati. I s početka mu naravno nisam vjerovao, no moja lektira, moje iskustvo, moj susret s Albertom Caeirom me jednostavno natjerao na to, tako da danas kad čitam Caeirove stihove ili primjerice osluškujem glazbu Johana Sebastiana Bacha, poglavito njegove korale, ja istovremeno, dakle sinestezijski, istovremeno, da tako kažem, i slušajući Bachovu glazbu, slušam Pessoine stihove i čitajući Pessoine, odnosno Caeirove stihove, slušam primjerice Bachovu glazbu. Dakle, sinestezija par excellence. Nakon tog mog kobnog sudbonosnog susreta s Pessoom, počeo sam se sustavno, čak i mogu reći slobodno poluprofesionalno, ako čak ne i profesionalno baviti njime, prije svega zbog činjenice da je riječ o višejezičnom i nadasve više osobnom, odnosno mnogo osobnom autoru, koji me zainteresirao između ostaloga i zbog toga jer je Pessoa možda posljednji enciklopedist u onom renesansnom smislu riječi, homo universale. Dakle, cijeli život se istovremeno bavio i književnošću, i filozofijom, i politologijom, i psihologijom, i jezikoslovljem, i muzikologijom u širom smislu, i raznim prirodnim znanostima i okultnim znanostima, kako bi, kako je sam govorio, spriječio veliku pošast fahidiotizma koji je sve više ovladava ovim svijetom. Za kraj bih spomenuo još jedan razlog koji me snažno privlači tom poslije svetog Antuna Lisabonskog, najpoznatijem sigurno Portugalcu, a to je njegovo uporno odbijanje da postane slavan za života. Kao što se uporno zalagao za posmrtnu slavu koju bi trebao težiti svaki normalan čovjek, tako se uporno zalagao za to da ne samo on, nego nijedan drugi čovjek svojevoljno, naglašavam ovo svojevoljno, ne postane slavan. Naime, postati svojevoljno slavan je teški, neizlječivi plebeizam. Samo glupan, oprostite na izrazu, nije moj nego Pessoin, može svjesno htjeti biti slavan, poznat. Onoga časa kada čovjek postane poznat, kada postane slavan, on gubi tlo pod nogama, on gubi ono ljudsko dostojanstvo, što bi rekao Pico della Mirandola, dignitas hominis. Zidovi njegova života postaju stakleni. I ne bih htio nikoga vrijeđati, mislim da je ipak došlo vrijeme da svako od nas uzme ogledalo u ruke i da se povremeno zapita jesu li zidovi njegova života postali stakleni. Ako da, onda mislim da je napokon došlo vrijeme da počnemo čitati ili barem proučavati Pessou.
Dragi gledatelji, sigurna sam da ste se kao ljubitelji književnosti već susreli s fascinantnim i zagonetnim dijelom Fernanda Pessoe. Sada ćete upoznati tog neuhvatljivog pjesnika na način kako ga dosad niste imali prilike upoznati. To će nam omogućiti irski filozof, književni znanstvenik i glazbenik koji živi i predaje na sveučilištu u Lisabonu, a u znanstvenom radu posvetio se Nietzscheu, Kierkegaardu, Joyceu i Pessoi. Bartholomew Ryan. Good evening, Mr. Ryan. Welcome back.
Thank you so much.
It's really a pleasure having you here in our studio. Recently, you published a book about Pessoa, Critical Lives. And having a pleasure hearing you how you discuss Finnegan's Wake in our studio, I think a year or two before, I said we had to have an opportunity to listen to your interpretation of Pessoa as well. So, why Pessoa? What drew you to him?
Great to be back here. Yes, Fernando Pessoa, well, he's a contemporary of Joyce, but they're very different in many ways. I think what drew me to Pessoa and what draws many people to Pessoa, and the great surprise, is his idea of seeing reality as a multiplicity. As he famously wrote in a scrap of paper, be plural like the universe. And I think that's more pertinent than ever in this time of virtual realities. And he really deconstructs and kind of dissolves our idea of reality and created what he saw as, or what he called heteronyms, literally more than 100 alter egos, other selves, and created a kind of an empire of poets, which is fascinating. And there's a poet there for everyone in Fernando Pessoa.
The title of your book is Critical Lives. Why?
Well, it's actually a fortuitous reason why. It's a series called Critical Lives by the publisher Reaction Books. And they do kind of biographies of all kinds of writers of modernity. But Critical Lives works well because Pessoa is more than one. Even, we say in Latin, nomen est omen. The name is the omen. And Pessoa, which means, in Portuguese, means person. He's a Portuguese poet from Lisbon. So person, but also persona is face, or a mask. And also person is the nothingness. So in Pessoa, there is this many lives. He rather than this kind of death of an author, a death of a self, he's actually created a plurality of selves. So lives makes a lot of sense, and critical because he's always looking at all the aspects of life for him, all the different forms of reality. And reality includes imagination, the impossibilities of things we mightn't conceive in a concrete world, but that's also reality. Reality is the totality of what is known and unknown. So Pessoa writes politically, sociologically, on the esoteric realms, looks into spiritualities, also aesthetics, of course. So there's many things that's going on with Fernando Pessoa. It's a vast universe, per se.
Yeah, as you said, he said that be plural like the universe. So he created over 100 fictional personalities, alter egos. He said that they are heteronymous as opposed to pseudonymous. So he didn't just write under their names, he wrote through them. He created them like individuals with their past biographies, personal characteristics, and also literary styles. So what do you think, did he only created them, or did they somehow create him also?
That's a great question, and you said it exactly right. It's very important to remember these are heteronyms, they're not pseudonyms, they're not false beings, they're real beings to him.
Yeah.
They're more real than concrete flesh and blood people. He really cried real tears when one of them dies, you know, or when he creates them. And as you say, yes, did they create him? Because in a moment he said that, in a way, the master appeared in me. Alberto Cairo is probably his kind of, what he saw as his greatest achievement, because Alberto Cairo was one of his great heteronyms, but he was so utterly different than Fernando Pessoa. He was everything that Pessoa wasn't. And for that reason, Pessoa saw that as a great achievement in art and literature. And so they kind of took a life of their own, and they all knew each other as well, you know, and they comment on each other. They comment on Fernando Pessoa. At one point, the very vociferous, most volatile and most prolific of the heteronyms is called Álvaro de Campos, who says, properly speaking, Pessoa doesn't actually exist, you know, in a way, and Pessoa enjoys this. There's a lot of humour going on, but deep philosophical thinking about what it is to be a human self. Because we're all kind of actors in our own way. We're always acting in some form. Pessoa then transforms or translates that into poetry and prose and political analysis and all these other forms of writing. It's fascinating.
Yeah, you mentioned Álvaro de Campos. In your book, you say that Álvaro de Campos maybe is still somewhere here around us. So how come? Can one heteronym be alive after author's death?
Yes, I mean, I was having some fun there, but in a way, there's two reasons for doing that. In a practical sense, he's the only one of the major that was never killed off in a way. Pessoa died in our own concrete reality, but also his kind of the great master, Alberto Cairo, died very young, in his 20s, of tuberculosis, like Pessoa's father and younger brother. And then you have Ricardo Reis, who's the other great heteronym, who was killed off by Saramago, the great Portuguese novelist who wrote a book called The Year of the Death of Ricardo Reis, who dies in 1936. But Álvaro de Campos is still out there in the way that he hasn't been killed off. But in another sense, I'm thinking about that because, in a way, he's all of us. Campos is all these neuroses and despair and vacillations and this equivocation of life, you know, the ambiguities. He really sums up the modern human being more than the others in a way. So he's kind of a futural persona for Fernando Pessoa.
So we can say that those personalities, those heteronyms, express different sides of Pessoa. Is there perhaps one heteronym which helps us to understand Pessoa better?
Oh, good question. It's probably, I mean, he had another, his kind of great unfinished masterpiece. It's important to remember, of course, with Pessoa, he finished very little that he started. He was a master of so many different plans and so many lists.
So many fragments after him left.
So many what-ifs of literature. But he did publish some great poems, and but he was working on a great novel, a kind of if you can call it that, an anti-novel called The Book of Disquiet, in Portuguese, Livro de Desassossego.
Yeah, very intriguing book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the author of that started off being Pessoa, then it was another heteronym called Vicente Guedes, and it ended up being under the authorship of Bernardo Soares, who's almost an anagram of Fernando Pessoa. And Pessoa calls him a semi-heteronym, a mutilation of himself. And he's probably closest to being Pessoa without the humour in a way, but he lives in Lisbon, he is many things that Pessoa thinks is in true Bernardo Soares, and he writes this book. It's kind of a book of dreaming ordinary things, you know, he never leaves the Rua dos Douradores, where he lives in the centre of Lisbon, and thinks about and dreams human existence. And he is probably closest to what Fernando Pessoa is. But as Fernando Pessoa, he died at the age of 47. The last year of his life, his heteronyms, some of the writings were kind of getting closer and closer to each other in a way. This kind of dissolving of these differences were coming together. Ricardo Reis wrote a poem called Countless Lives Inhabit Us. It could have been written by any of them, or Fernando Pessoa was like a mantra for what Pessoa is actually doing, but it was written by a heteronym. So they're kind of coming closer and closer together by the end of Pessoa's life.
You're a philosopher. How did Pessoa use his heteronyms to reveal or to express different philosophies?
Well, the greatness of Pessoa also is that he really kind of provokes and wakes up the philosopher to what the self is. I mean, he's a great philosophical thinker of what it is to be and to the I in modernity. And of course, the birth of modern philosophy with Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Pessoa writes, I doubt, therefore I think. But then you have another of his heteronyms, Alberto Cairo, says, I think, therefore I disobey God. Then you have Álvaro de Campos saying, I think, but if I think so much, I become so many. I think, therefore I am many. So he really dissolves the Cartesian idea of I think, therefore I am. For Pessoa, the thinking, I could even say, I think, therefore I am not. By thinking, we become something else. So this is a major philosophical conundrum when we think of modernity, and especially with postmodernity and the internet age and fugitive virtual selves. We don't know exactly what is the self anymore. And Pessoa really anticipated all that in a very rich and exciting manner, not in a nihilistic way, but actually in a way that actually we could create in various forms. And philosophy is still to answer that Pessoa opened up in the 20th century. And of course, he is a poet, but he famously said in English, I'm a poet animated by philosophy, but I'm not a philosopher with poetic faculties. So he remained a poet, but always dealing with philosophical themes, and very much can be seen as a philosopher or be used by philosophy to answer questions, particularly on what it is to be a subject or a self. And he kind of dissolves these things, subject and object, often when he tries to create these different poets, or he does very successfully.
So what could you say? Is his poetry more intellectual or more emotional?
I say it's both.
Both.
You know, I like to say it's both. Yeah. He's been criticised sometimes by poets saying it was too intellectual. I mean, the great Brazilian poet Carlos Drummond de Andrade said there was something too cold about Pessoa. But I disagree. Depends who you're talking about. I mean,
yeah, I disagree also.
Yes, Álvaro de Campos is full of feeling. He's the sensationist. Yeah. He feels so much in every single way. He's full of emotions. Even Alberto Cairo, he was the kind of Zen poet living in the countryside, but he writes 6 love poems, which are absolutely beautiful love poems. Yeah. That are some of the greatest love poems of the 20th century. So you have this various, he feels, and he mixes it up. That the philosopher needs to feel more, and the poet needs to think more. You know, this fusion of poetry and philosophy. That, you know, the philosopher always is pursuing the truth, and the poet is the mode of truth. With Fernando Pessoa, it's both. It's the pursuit and the mode of truth. Writing a great poem, it gives you that access to thinking about pursuing something, a truthful life, but also being inside life as a truthful. Your existence is your truth per se.
You mentioned also Pessoa's unfinished work, the Book of Disquiet, very intriguing book. Bernardo Soares, a character from the book, is often considered as non-heteronym. How come? And why is he so special? And why that restless writing from that book? Why is so appealing to contemporary readers? What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a few things about him already, about this idea of being a semi-heteronym or a mutilation of himself. Yeah. I think he captures so much of the 20th century. If you think of some of the great works of the 20th century, a lot of them are unfinished. You know, Kafka's novels, or Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities. And then you have these kind of night journeys, a lot of night books, you know, into the darkness. And this book was written between 1913 and 1934. So these are dark years in Europe, you know. World War I, many collapse of empires, and new extreme political regimes, fascism and Stalinism and all these things. And Pessoa is writing through this. And I think Bernardo Suarez captures this kind of uncertainty. He begins by saying he almost lives in a time when people have lost their faith in God, but it's a time when they're embracing a new humanity. And he says, I'm kind of in between this. I'm not ready to accept that God has disappeared. I'm not quite ready to accept this kind of obsession with humanity as humanism that he was wary of. So he's trying to navigate between the two. There's another poem called The King of Gaps. And I think people relate to that, this uncertainty, living with our doubt, trying to deal with that. And he talks about tedium as well, the tedium of existence and the nothingness of existence, trying to find new modes of value in a time when the famous saying by Nietzsche, God is dead. What he meant by that really is that our kind of conceived, established values have all collapsed, like, you know, in religion or in the monarchy, in politics. We're now searching for new modes of thinking. And of course, we know in the 20th century, this led to very frightful and monstrous regimes, but it also led for people like Joyce or Pessoa or Kafka to write extraordinary, kind of unfinished, kind of ruinous works. You know, there's a fragmentation happening there, and they became part of the aesthetic of finding a new mode of writing. It's very interesting. You see this in philosophy as well, with Wittgenstein and these unfinished works, and with Adorno and Walter Benjamin. He's not alone in this kind of fragmentary type of writing and trying to, even this openness to new modes of thinking.
Pessoa often wrote about nothingness. Is nothingness fundamental to his work?
It is, actually. You see this word nada, which is N-A-D-A in Portuguese, present in a lot of his key kind of iconic poems. But I would say we would think of nothingness not as some kind of nihilistic despair, but rather this kind of void that allows for this openness for attention. You know, we're in this nothingness. Again, it's back to the question of now we're living in a time where we don't have these kind of Archimedean points of value to hold on to, but he's going into the nothingness. And he said that, you know, in the past, we had the great kind of voyagers going across the high seas, like the Argonauts discovering new lands or all this. But for him, it's like, I'm an Argonaut of sensations. I'm an Argonaut of going into the consciousness of this void. So this void ends up being a place of attention and also our suffering, that how can we... And he likes to leave this openness. It's of our own being is this nothingness. And famously, there's a great poem by Álvaro de Campos, which every Portuguese person knows the first lines. It's called The Tobacco Shop, or Tabacaria in Portuguese. And it's lovely in Portuguese, if I may say it in Portuguese, because to hear the double, I don't know what it's like in Croatian, but it says, he said, "Não sou nada, nunca serei nada, não posso querer ser nada. A parte disso, tenho a mim todos os sonhos do mundo." So
please
literally,
continue.
literally is, I am nothing, I will never be anything,
yeah.
I cannot want to be anything, but apart from this, I have all the dreams of the world inside me. So this openness of the nothingness opens up a whole plurality of worlds. So these double negatives of the nothing. So we can think of this nothingness not something that we are afraid of, but to embrace this void, and out of that void we can create. And that, I guess all philosophers and artists need to go into that void in order to access these new realities for us.
In your book, Critical Lives, you mentioned Pessoa's friend who said that Fernando had to die because he knew too much. What do you think he knew?
Okay, well, yeah, it's a very cryptic sentence, right? I think he's relating, it was a journalist friend of his, you know, one aspect that's important to bring up is Pessoa's interest in the esoteric realms, in astrology.
Yes, and the occult, yeah.
In the occult, and he wasn't alone, of course. William Butler Yeats and other contemporary poets were interested in this as well, conversing with the dead. He did this, and it was very useful for him in order to create characters. So knowing too much, I mean, this is a question for the ages. I can't answer that question, but I can say that he was always trying to tap into alternative realities. So helping astrology, he was actually at the time probably one of the foremost experts of astrology in the esoteric realms in Portugal, and all his major heteronyms have astrology charts that he draws up. They're very important. The date of birth of these figures, their star sign, where they were born, they're very important for conceiving his thinking. So he knew too much. I mean, this is the problem, the Hamlet question. By knowing too much, it makes you paralyzed, you know. This one interpretation of Hamlet, or by knowing too much, you become more sorrowful, as the Ecclesiastes says, increasing knowledge, increasing sorrow. But Pessoa was not sorrowful. He was very much engaged with existence. There's not this idea. He was always engaged with people. A lot of them, of course, were in his imagination, but that imagination for him was just as real as the day-to-day existence.
In his poem Autopsychography, he said poet is a faker and that he fakes emotions and even fools himself. So what do you think about that? Did he have some kind of special artistic truth, poetic truth he believed in?
Yes, because for him, and he was quite inspired by people like Oscar Wilde and also William Shakespeare, the word is fingidor in Portuguese, or poeta é fingidor. The poet is a faker or a pretender or a deceiver, or a feigner is maybe, I think, is the translation that Richard Zenit went for, the great translator into English, because feigner is a word that Shakespeare uses in the play As You Like It. The truth is through feigning. We will, when you deceive, or as Oscar Wilde says, put on a mask and you can tell the truth. So for Pessoa, it was very important as an artist. You're always faking or pretending or forging. Forging is a nice word in English because forging is both, you're deceiving, you're making counterfeit things, but you're also like a blacksmith making something at the same time. So for Pessoa, making is a way of deceiving as well, and to be as othering of your own art is the big gestures. That's why for him Shakespeare was the great master, because Shakespeare is nowhere to be found in his plays. There are so many great personalities in Shakespeare, but Shakespeare has disappeared into the work, and that's what Pessoa wanted to do. He said to make a drama in people. He wasn't writing plays, but he was a dramatic thinker, and to show these different characters for you as a reader to find different types. And that was, for him, the vocation of a great artist, is to kind of lose oneself completely in the art.
What about his legacy? He's buried near great Portuguese figures like Vasco da Gama. Can we compare his legacy to such great historic figures?
Oh, definitely, I think so. I mean, Camões was a great poet as well, a very different kind of poet, of course, but a great epic poet from the 16th century, where he did everything that Pessoa didn't do. He was traveling all over the world. He was captured. He was a slave. He lost his eye in combat. He was a womanizer, probably, had a very full love life and wrote great poems. But Pessoa was always in one place at the same time. But he was the great modernist poet. I kind of hope that Pessoa was originally buried in the Prazeres cemetery in Lisbon, which was kind of the every person's cemetery in Camp de Ric in Lisbon. But he was transferred over in the 1980s to the great Jerónimos monastery, where, as you say, Vasco da Gama and Camões are buried to be with these greats. But I think he belongs with the every person, with the barber. His barber went to his funeral, and he was, as I don't underestimate this idea of literally dreaming ordinary things. And that's where I see the connection with someone like Joyce. It's looking at the ordinary person and making that extraordinary, which is all of us. Each of us are unique. So yes, he is more than welcome in he's one of the great poets, not only in Portugal, of course, of the 20th century globally.
Yeah. So at the end, if we could imagine such a thing that you could talk to him, what would you say to him from our time?
To say, okay, Fernando, what heteronym are you going to create now for us in the 21st century, in a time where we have this amalgamated information, artificial intelligence? People are so happy to hand over probably the most beautiful thing that we have is our consciousness and our critical intelligence. And I think Pessoa would be very curious about this, and I think he might make a wonderful new heteronym. Which way would it go? I don't know. Would it be a robot? Would it be how can one love through all these new technologies? And that's probably what I'd ask Fernando Pessoa as a poet today. What do we do as poets? Because that's really what's important. Because I think, as I close, to be a poet for someone like Pessoa, or the great poet, is to access memory and to transform memory. And we're living in a time where we're losing our memory, or the amnesia. And Pessoa transforms memory, both fact and fiction. And I think he'd probably try to find a way in accessing memory and to remember to read or write a poem is an act of resistance, or it's dissolving time. You have just to read a poem is to stop things. And that's a great thing to do in these days where we're all forgetting all the time in this time of amnesia. So that would be my question to Fernando. Give us advice.
Great idea. Mr. Ryan, thank you for the interview and for coming to Croatia.
It's been a pleasure.
U vremenu koje nas sve češće tjera da budemo samo jedno lice, Fernando Pessoa nas podsjeća da je ljudska duša mnoštvo i da se u toj unutarnjoj mnoštvenosti skriva poezija života. Ta poezija života iz Pessoina djela ostaje s nama poput tragova snova koje ne možemo do kraja zapamtiti, ali nas mogu promijeniti. Dragi gledatelji, čitajmo klasike jer u njima uvijek možemo pronaći nova viđanja svijeta, ali i sebe samih. Doviđenja za 2 tjedna.